In the previous fundamentals videos, we've discussed the pump, the nozzles, and the pressure and flow of fluid in the tubing when the system is misting. In this video, we're going to cover what happens the rest of the time, when the system is starting and stopping, as well as discuss what can happen between mist cycles. Let's start with shutdown. Recall this diagram of a simple misting system from the pump video. When the system is operating in what is called steady state, the pump is full, drawing fluid from the reservoir at the same rate the nozzles are misting it out, and bypassing and recirculating the rest. The pressure in the nozzle circuit has stabilized, somewhere around 200 psi, and the nozzles are open and misting. But what happens at the instant the pump stops at the end of the mist cycle? The pump stops pushing fluid and applying pressure, but there still is at least 200 psi of pressure at each nozzle. Does the pressure in the nozzle circuit just stay at 200 psi until the pump starts up again with the next mist cycle? The answer to that is no. Recall this graph where we plotted the relationship between pressure and flow for the nozzles. As long as the pressure at a nozzle is above about 80 psi, the fluid will continue to flow out of the nozzles. Since the fluid is not being replaced by the pump as it exits the nozzles, the pressure in the nozzle circuit will eventually fall. Remember our cross-section diagram of a nozzle. This compressed spring is trying to return to its original length, and as it does, it pushes the ball toward the nozzle inlet. As the fluid loses pressure, the force of the spring overcomes the force of the fluid, and at around 80 psi, the nozzle finally closes and the flow stops completely. If the only way for fluid to escape the system is through the nozzles, this can present a significant problem. At pressures below about 90 psi, the nozzle isn't really misting. It's streaming or dripping, which looks like this. As the flow gets smaller, it takes longer for the pressure to drop and the nozzles to close, and the streaming and then the dripping can go on for a very long time, until the pressure drops enough for the ball to seat in the nozzle inlet and close completely. Now it turns out that in addition to relieving pressure through the nozzles, the fluid can make its way backward through the pump and also relieve the pressure in the circuit, like so. But this can also take an unacceptably long time to happen. We need the nozzles to close quickly. MistAway's solution to this issue is to incorporate what we call an auto drain valve in the line. It is positioned just downstream of the pump, like so. The valve itself looks like this. When the pump shuts off, this valve offers the path of least resistance for fluid to exit the nozzle circuit. It allows the pressure to decay rapidly and allows the nozzles to close quickly. Now you will have noticed that the fitting is always open. So even during the mist cycle, there is fluid coming out of the valve. You might worry that this flow could rob pressure and flow to the nozzle circuit, but fortunately, that isn't the case. Look at a cross-section diagram of the valve. The orifice in the valve presents resistance that restricts the flow to a small volume. And you'll recall from the pump video that the pump has lots of extra capacity, and the flow through this line is very small relative to that capacity. So it's not a problem. Okay, so we've established that it's really important for the pressure in the line to decay quickly when the pump shuts down so that the nozzles don't stream or drip. And we accomplish that by putting an auto drain valve in the line. But what happens after the nozzles close? Look at this representation of a nozzle circuit. Once the nozzles close, where is the fluid in the line going to go? We know from the previous discussion that it will move back through the pump. If the fluid in the line is elevated above the fluid in the drum, gravity will drain it back through the pump. If that happens after the evening mist cycle, what will happen at the start of the morning cycle? There's going to be a delay after the pump starts until the lines are filled with fluid and the system can generate enough pressure to open the nozzles. How long is that delay? Well, it's longer than you might think. With 10 feet between nozzles, the average nozzle circuit has about 400 feet of quarter-inch tubing. Apply some high school geometry, and you can figure out that the volume required to fill that tubing is 0.6 gallons. Now we know that the pump will push 107 gallons per hour while it's filling the lines. So you can calculate that it will take 20 seconds to fill the tubing if the lines are completely empty. If you've programmed a 45-second mist cycle, that means you'll really only get 25 seconds of misting before the pump shuts off. So clearly we need to find a way to leave fluid in the line between mist cycles. MistAway accomplishes this by incorporating a solenoid valve in the tubing between the auto drain valve and the nozzle circuit. At the end of the mist cycle, the valve closes, leaving fluid in the lines and ready for the next mist cycle. But when does the valve close? If we allowed the valve to close right when the pump shut off, what would happen? Our nozzles would stream and then drip, as we just discussed, right? So to prevent this, at the end of the mist cycle, our controller actually holds that valve open for a set period of time before it is allowed to close. This allows the pressure to decay quickly, closing the nozzles, but still leaves fluid in the lines. And because all nozzle circuits are different with respect to the way pressure decays in them, we've made that hold time a setting in the controller that you can change. We'll talk about that in another video where we discuss setting up the unit. Now let's talk about something else that can happen between mist cycles. What can happen to the contents of the drum if a fitting comes loose, or the tubing in the landscaping gets cut by the yard service by a guy with a weed whacker? If the loose fitting is below the level of fluid in the reservoir, it sets up an accidental siphon, where the fluid can actually flow uphill, up and out of the drum, and then down and out of the tubing. Now this is obviously a problem since what is flowing out onto the ground is a dilute insecticide. And it turns out that you can lose a whole drum pretty quickly. We conducted a test where we set up a 55-gallon drum unit and connected it to some tubing with an opening about 50 feet away. We allowed the unit to mist, and we set up a siphon, and water began running out of the drum through the length of tubing and out onto the ground. We then measured the fluid remaining in the drum every hour for a period and charted what we found. At the beginning of the test, there was about 32 inches of water in the drum. After 4 hours, here on the chart, we had lost half of the volume. And in 8 hours, here, we had lost 3/4 of it. As I said, quickly. So since we know we can't always protect the nozzle circuit from the lawn service, how do we stop a siphon? It turns out that the same solenoid valve that we use to maintain fluid in the lines between mist cycles also prevents siphons. In fact, we sometimes call the valve an anti-siphon valve. It isolates the drum contents from the nozzle circuit, and if there's a cut in the line, the most you can lose is the line fill. But what happens to the fluid the next time the unit comes on? Well, you usually get a leak. Not always, but usually. MistAway's units have leak detection capability, and we'll cover how that works in another video. Now let's end this video by quickly summarizing what we covered. First, to prevent dripping nozzles at the end of a mist cycle, MistAway systems incorporate an auto drain valve downstream of the pump that allows the pressure in the nozzle circuit to decay quickly at shutdown. Second, to ensure the nozzles begin misting quickly at startup, the systems incorporate an electronic solenoid valve that works to leave fluid in the lines between mist cycles. And third, that same solenoid valve prevents a siphon resulting from a cut in the nozzle circuit from emptying the insecticide reservoir out onto the ground.